Okay, well these days we all use Nokogiri when we're parsing our HTML or XML. Mike Dalessio is one of the authors of Nokogiri. He helps run the Pivotal Labs office in New York City. He's, like I said, he's one of the authors of Nokogiri along with Aaron Patterson and an international man of mystery. And here he is to talk to you about Nokogiri. Thank you, Mike.
I wanted to start just by saying thank you to Josh and the other organizers. Josh first invited me to speak about Nokogiri to a room full of strangers probably 5 years ago at JRUBY. And he didn't learn from that mistake and invited me back again today. So he has my gratitude for that. Nokogiri is just a library. I think it's an interesting story because Nokogiri is like a second child. I have a daughter. Nokogiri is like a second child. My personal story is kind of wrapped up in the evolution of this gem and the Ruby community. And I thought it would just make an interesting talk, so hopefully you do too. The summary of my kind of personal story is many years ago, I sent my first open source contribution, pre-GitHub days. This was when everything was on RubyForge. And I met some interesting people as a result. It's Pat Nakajima and Aaron Patterson. Aaron became a really close friend through my collaboration with him on a couple of projects. And Pat introduced me to Pivotal Labs, where I learned how to write code better. I met even more interesting people. I got a job and got promoted. I love Business Cat. I'm sorry, I had to throw it in. And where I eventually tricked Josh into inviting me to GoGaRuCo. I first wanted to cover probably the 5 most frequently asked questions about Nokogiri in no particular order. Number 1, what is Nokogirl? Does anybody know Nokogirl? So Magnus Holm wrote a gem, Nokogirl, that simply installs Nokogiri as a dependency and then chides you on your spelling ability. So I think the question everyone wants to ask is, what is Nokogiri with an I, not an L? It's, I guess, a mark against Courier font. You can't tell the difference. So Nokogiri is basically, for those of you who don't know, it's just a Ruby API to parse HTML and XML. You know, it corrects broken markup if you need it to. It's got a SAX parser, pull parser, XSLT, all the enterprisey features you could ever dream of. And I know what you're asking yourselves, like, OMG, isn't that super boring? I don't think it's boring, but I'll preface my story about that with a confession, which is that I hate XML. I really, really, really hate it. And you might wonder, like, why I would spend my time building an XML parsing library if I hate it so bad, but it's because I actually love making painful things not painful. That's my own itch that I like to scratch. When I see something that's super, super painful, I just want to fix it. And there are other parts of working on Nokogiri that are rewarding too. Not to brag, and it's not a contest, but like Nokogiri's been downloaded almost 15 million times. This is just amazebears. I can't believe that this many people are using some software that I worked on. For comparison, stop. So for comparison, Rails has been downloaded about 28 million times, and Formtastic is about 1.7 million. So that's kind of like the range of like popular gems, I think. But I like to actually think about this in terms of like the recording industry numbers, right? So you look at Rails, it's got like 28 million downloads. Kiss has about 28 million albums sold. So I like to think of Rails as Kiss, right? It's been around forever, and it used to be really bleeding edge, but now it's like what your parents listen to. Highly produced, glam rock, you either hate it or you love it. Kiss. Formtastic is like, oh, it's Come On Eileen. It's catchy. It's got a hook. Everybody hums it. Everybody's used it at least once, right? Like, it's cool. And if, in this range of recording industry, then, like, oh, right in the middle is Nokogiri. It's Kelly Clarkson. It's adult contemporary. It's appealing. It's not offensive. It's kind of there in the background all the time. Okay. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that, yeah, Nokogiri does a boring thing, but it does it well. People seem to like it, and that makes me really happy, and that's why I'm involved in open source. This is a theme I'm going to be talking about over the next 25 minutes. Question number 4, what does Nokogiri mean? Nokogiri is a Japanese word. for a particular type of saw. And this is a little bit of tender love wordplay, right? Because the idea is you've got a dense forest of XML trees, and you need to cut through them with a saw of some kind. I don't know if you guys know this, but tender love likes wordplay. So this is just another instance of that kind of going on. So the fifth FAQ I wanted to touch on a little bit is, I'm sure you guys know this one, you've asked yourself this one, which is, why can't I install Nokogiri on Mac OS X 10.8.4 running backwards? So that's actually not a question, but we will actually cover installation a little bit later. So we'll circle back to that one. So a good question to ask is, like, why is history important? Normally history should be kind of like a really boring topic. For me, though, history is like, it's the testing ground of ideas. It's an opportunity to learn, like what worked, what didn't work, where did we totally fail and fall on our faces. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here today. So the story starts in 2006, or my story does. They kind of set the stage. Ruby 1.8.5 and Rails 1.1.6 are out there. Subversion is the cool new thing on the block. NASA launches a space probe for Pluto, and immediately it gets redefined as not a planet. And most interestingly, if you actually Googled for Aaron Patterson in 2006, you would actually find most of the hits were for a serial murderer named Aaron Patterson. And not actually Tenderlove, the software developer. The state of Ruby parsers in 2006, rake-XML is in the standard library. It's a pure Ruby parser, and it's super, super, super slow. And it also doesn't do anything about fixing broken markup. So as long as you didn't mind it being slow and had perfectly formed markup, it was great. HForCot was the de facto standard, right? Josh touched on this. Everybody loved it. It had a great API. And libXML Ruby is a close runner-up. This was actually a Ruby wrapper around libXML, which is what Nokogiri turned into. But it crashed at times. It wasn't a great API because it just matched exactly what the C API was in Ruby. And so you could still shoot yourself in the foot the same way you could with the C API as well. At the time, I was working for a company called US PowerGen. This was so long ago that they didn't have like transparent GIFs. So I had to actually make this by hand. Anyway, at the time I was scraping HTML with Mechanize. But more importantly for this story, I was scraping super secret HTML, right? So I needed like support for client-side certs when I was going and getting the pages, downloading them, and scraping data out of them. So Mechanize didn't support any kind of client-side certs at the time, so I wrote some code and I emailed a patch to Tenderlove, like out of the blue. I'm like, hey dude, here it is. Hey dude, I like your library, here's a patch. That's my first pull request for you kids out there. You used to just email patches around, and that was how you got things done. So this is actually my first contribution to open source ever, and Tenderlove was amazing. He was open and kind and supportive and responsive, merged the patch. It was really encouraging. So I sent more patches, and eventually he got tired of merging them by hand and gave me commit privileges on Mechanize. And then I kept contributing. It was like crack at this point, right? I just kept sending more patches and fixing more stuff. And time passed. 2008 rolls around. Again, setting the scene, Ruby 1.8.7, Rails 2.1, stock markets crash. Thanks bankers, that's great. So I was working at my own startup at this point in time called Pharos. It's a terrible name, can't Google for it. I was scraping HTML with Mechanize, again. But more importantly for this story, I was scraping lots of broken HTML with Mechanize. And I was running into problems with HForCot. HForCot wasn't correcting markup the way I expected or the way I thought it should. There were a lot of off by one errors. When you wrote a CSS query, HForCot starts with 0 index, whereas CSS should start with 1 index. And also, it would just crash if your HTML was exactly 16 KB long. So there are all these problems with it. And I was kind of unhappy, and then I kind of noticed I was stalking Tenderlove on GitHub at this point. And I was like, hey man, I see that you have like this library that you're working on that's XML. Is libXML going to fix up markup the way HForCot did, or is it going to be better? And he was very indulgent. He's like, yes, it actually fixes broken HTML better than HForCot does. I have test cases that show it. And he even said, I've submitted these test cases back, and I would have patched hprocot to fix it, but it's too hard for me to read, right? So let's pause for a minute and think about this. You got Why the Lucky Stiff, and you've got Aaron Patterson. And they're both trying to write code, and they can't understand each other's code. And that kind of gives me a lot of hope that normal developers like me actually aren't crazy for not being able to walk into a gem cold and understand every line of code that's in there. So that's kind of encouraging. So then I use the 5 most significant words you can ever use to an open source maintainer, which is, how can I help out? I guess it could have been 4 words. Anyway, how can I help out? And of course, you know, he jumped right on it. He was like, hey man, this is great. I've started a project. There's no C and it uses DL. And we started coding from there. So it's worth talking about what DL is for a minute. DL is dynamic language binding. This is the ability to call C libraries without actually having to write C code. So you write Ruby, it calls directly through to the C method, the C function. Here's an example. This is where we're actually defining for Ruby what a method looks like, XML read memory. This is the kind of the key parsing method inside libxml. And you can see that it's pretty ghetto, right? Like you've got to load your Linux SO, and if that doesn't work, then you go, oh, I must be on a Mac, I'll load the dilib. And notably, you're just passing in the C description of the function, right? And DL was not very smart about this. You had to do a lot of your own checking. Like I have to check if the URL is null, and if it is, I have to pass in a 0 so that C understands that it's a null pointer. And it worked okay, but it was really, really slow. It was slow because DL would reparse that that string description every time you made a method call. It would recalculate how to serialize and reinflate classes. And I would have fixed it, but it was really experimental code. It didn't have a lot of tests. It was really, really gnarly code. This is like early Ruby code. So we killed it and started writing a C extension. So this is what the C code looks like. It's very similar to what you do in DL. I'm still doing the same like null checks, right? So if it's nil, I pass the null. Otherwise, I pass the string in. And this is kind of how we started coding against libxml. The toughest problem we had while doing this was trying to figure out how libxml actually managed its own memory. It turns out that it's pretty straightforward how it does it when it's not a buggy version, but mapping that into the Ruby world for garbage collection actually turned out to be really, really interesting. So here's a brief lesson in how memory management works. So you've got a document. The document has many nodes, and a node can have many attributes or namespaces. So these are all C structures that have been allocated under the hood. And then you've got Ruby objects. So there's a 1-to-1, or there could be 0, but there's no more than 1 Ruby object for each C struct. So you've got a document Ruby object, you've got a node Ruby object. And the trick is to get these so that they reference each other properly so that garbage collection can happen in the right order. So libxml frees things from the top down. You free the document, and then it recursively frees everything going down. So we have to make sure that if I have a reference to a node, that the document won't get freed because my reference to the node will then point to a C structure that had been completely vaporized by libxml. So you have to have all these different references. We had to be very, very careful about how to do it. And things were going pretty good for a while. And then we started having more crashes, and it turns out there's the document has a dictionary it uses to cache strings because a lot of attributes get repeated when you're looking at XML or HTML. And so attributes and namespaces refer back to the dictionary. So if you move the node to a new document and then free the old document, like everything's seg faults, but only sometimes. So these are the kind of problems that we had to deal with. I'll skip that slide. Another fun fact is that libxml2, if you have 2 string nodes next to each other, it'll merge them into one big string node, right? Which kind of makes sense. You have 2 string nodes next to each other, it's one big string. But the question then is, what do you do if I have a Ruby object for each of the 2 old strings, and now there's only 1 string? Like, what is my Ruby object actually pointing to now? What is it actually referencing? So we had to come up with all these tricks to make sure that garbage collection, we weren't leaking, and that garbage collection was happening properly. And I had to write comments to actually explain all this crazy logic. I'm not going to actually read this because it's insane, but we actually had to jump through hoops to make sure that everything was working properly. Another fun fact is that different versions actually have different bugs in how they merge or don't merge these nodes, so there's version checks all over the place. Really, really lame stuff. Super amount of pain. In summary, if you want to write a C extension, make sure that you know valgrind. Valgrind is an awesome tool. It's actually an x86 emulator that will trap like invalid memory access and tell you where you're leaking. Pretty cool. And perftools.rb. This is an Aman Gupta port or hack on top of Google's perftools to let you actually look at combined Ruby and C stack traces. And it's great for looking at performance bottlenecks. Super, super useful in early years of Nokogiri development. I'm going to move on to API design. So at the time, we were struggling to find what a good API would look like. And so we stole the best one we could find, which was hprocots, right? Like the first version of Nokogiri was a straight off ripoff of hprocots API. And for a while, we even had a shim that was totally backwards compatible with hprocot. So if you're using hprocot, you could just drop in Nokogiri with this shim and it would work. We like to actually, we called it the bug compatible version because we actually would just go in and introduce all the off by one errors that hprocot had, et cetera. So we killed it after a few months because it just wasn't useful anymore and it was really hard to maintain. The first official release of Nokogiri was November 17th. This was DST weekend. So here's a pro tip. Don't release software on daylight savings time weekend if you have a job in energy trading. Not a good plan. So it was a really hectic weekend. I wanted to do like all these blog posts, and I had all these great marketing ideas, and none of them actually happened because I was wrapped up in fixing daylight savings time bugs. The community response at the time was a little bit mixed. Some people liked it, some people had kind of adverse reactions to it. Some early adopters that I want to call out. Brian Helmkamp wrote Loofah, or what became Loofah, which is an HTML sanitizer on top of Nokogiri. He was working at WePlay at the time and needed to be able to sanitize user-generated data. Slide Down, Pat Nakajima, used it to generate slide presentation software, which was pretty cool. And Merb started using it in their test suite. And I don't know if you guys know this about Yehuda, but he likes things a certain way. So he pushed us really hard for performance bottlenecks because the Merb test suite was getting slower and slower. And so he pushed really, really hard. And I appreciate that he was actually poking at us to make sure that we were doing everything we could to make it performant. On the flip side, a lot of people really loved hprocot and kind of saw this as an attack on this loved thing, this little, beautiful little thing that they loved using. And also people like to argue a lot about benchmarks in 2008. Is that still true today? I can't tell. No. Exactly. Thanks, Josh. So just, I'll post this slide deck later. I'll tweet it and post them up so you can click through some of these links if you're interested, like historic links from the past about people arguing over benchmarks. And I published some BS benchmarks of my own. And in retrospect, this whole benchmarking thing was really, really pointless because at the end of the day, we were writing C code and it was going to be faster than anything else regardless, right? So kind of like publicly debating performance at times seems like you're debating which movie star is hotter. So it's pointless in that nobody wins, but at the end of the day, the movie star is driven to get plastic surgery, right? So that's fun. So I'm going to go off on a kind of a personal tangent for just a minute. So in 2008, I was actually introduced to Pivotal Labs, which is where I work today, by Pat Nakajima, who is a huge fan of Nokogiri for whatever reason. And I was hired largely at Pivotal Labs based on what I did for Nokogiri and Mechanize, right? Like I feel like I went in, I did the interview, I flailed a little bit, they still hired me. So I was like, yes, that's awesome. And I credit a lot of that, the introduction and being able to get through the interview and getting hired, I credit to the open source work I did. So Pivotal high five. Any pivots out there today? Woot. Great. Hey, you guys are all in a group. Why don't you spread out a little bit? Okay. So I want to kind of just pause for a minute and think about that. As long ago as 2005, right, DHH says, I can't imagine hiring someone I don't already know through open source. And then like 2 weeks ago, Brian Cantrell, who's an SVP of engineering at Joyent, said the exact same thing. He's like, hey, open source is your farm system. You should be out there using it. And despite this, right, almost 10 years of people saying this, we still get resumes regularly that don't have any references to open source or links to GitHub. We have no idea what the code they actually write looks like. And this is kind of silly. So if any of you are looking to get a better job, I would just recommend getting involved in open source. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. End of tangent. Sorry for the rant. Just wanted to get it out there. So August of 2009, this tweet went out over the interwebs. Programming is rather thankless. You see your works become replaced by superior ones in a year and unable to run it all in a few more. Does anybody recognize this tweet? Yeah, so this was Why the Lucky Stiff, about a week or two before he vanished himself. So I've had it didn't occur to me at the time, but I've had a lot of people kind of tell me, hey man, I bet that tweet was about Nokogiri. And that makes me kind of sad. For me, this is what software is all about. It's about constantly improving. That's why I'm in this business. I think it's why most of us are in the business of just making things better, right? Scratching your own itch. And so I love why, but I just don't really agree with this sentiment. And you can actually even see this theme runs through his recent manifesto that he published too, if anybody has read that. So this makes me really sad, and I miss why, but I don't agree with this. So around this time, this is late 2009, 2010, it was kind of like the demarcation line for the dawn of JRUBY. It had been around for a long time, but it finally started getting kind of some street cred, and people started really using it. But I wanted to take a poll real quick. How many people's preferred deployment platform is MRI of some flavor? Okay, so for future people watching this on YouTube, that was probably 80% of the room. How many people are, how many people use JRUBY as their preferred deployment platform? Okay, so JRUBY people like to sit in the front, and MRI people like to sit in the back. That's great. So JRUBY people, there were probably 20 or so raised their hands. How many are using Rubinius or IronRuby or some other flavor of Ruby as their preferred deployment environment? Okay, that's interesting. So when I've given this talk a couple of times, and the average is about a 10-to-1 ratio of MRI to JRUBY. So that's useful information. Thank you, guys. So in 2009, JRUBY didn't fully support the C extension API, which meant Nokogiri didn't work on JRUBY. I think they've made a lot of progress in this, but I kind of stopped paying attention. Somebody can inform me after the talk if it's much better now. So this was a huge problem because JRUByists loved Nokogiri and wanted to use it. I had a dream. I wanted to write one code base that would run everywhere. It would run on Rubinius, it would run on MRI, it would run on JRUBY. And what I like to call this is my FFI phase. Like Monet had his sunflower phase. This was my FFI phase. So FFI, for those of you who don't know, is foreign function interface, which is, again, is Ruby calling native C code directly. So this is like DL, except it actually worked. Here's an example of what FFI looks like. You can see that up top, I'm declaring the method again. And the method is not a string, defined as a string, but it's defined with symbols. So it's a little more optimized. And the call is pretty much the same again. It's the same call you've been seeing over and over again. So the syntax is roughly similar, but it was much, much faster. Now, FFI is totally, totally magic. FFI does some amazing stuff. It knows what chipset you're on. It knows what registers it needs to go for when it's moving parameters around. Wayne Meissner did an amazing, amazing job getting FFI to where it is today. So total credit goes out to him. And at the time, I was super excited about this. And I wanted to rewrite all the C in Ruby using the DL. And I spent about 5 months doing this. And I actually looked like that most of the time because I was on coffee and late nights. So interesting statistic about this is it was about a 3 to 4 ratio of Ruby FFI code to replace the C code. That's pretty lackluster. Ruby is a really powerful language. I like to think that you can do things very tersely. And that's kind of a smell, right? And it also was really, really painful. Basically, I was writing C in Ruby, right? So you can see there's like a 1-to-1. I spaced it nicely for you. Except for the variable declaration over on the left, which is the C code. On the right, you can see the FFI code. And it's 1-to-1 lines of code. So any lines that skipped were actually just variable declarations for the most part. So that was painful. Segfault-driven development. FFI has no compile time checking of anything, right? So if I misdeclared the function, it would crash. And I would have to pull it up in the debugger and walk through the stack and figure out what I did wrong. Really, really painful. Portable string handling, turns out, is really, really hard. FFI on MRI would work, and when I ran it on JRUBY, it would crash. It was because JVM was like, oh, you totally don't need that string anymore. I'm going to free it out from under you. So there were a lot of edge cases. That became really difficult to work with. And the FFI code was no clearer than the C code. It didn't actually look like Ruby code. Like, this is not the Ruby that I fell in love with, right? I do not want to write Ruby that looks like this. The bottom stanza there is me iterating through a linked list. Like, no joke. I'm doing linked lists in Ruby. And the last big pain was the performance penalty. It's much better now, but serializing is always going to be slower than the native function call. This is how much slower it was for some arbitrary benchmark. Harassment-driven development. I probably don't have time to go into this conference story, But the summary is that I got harassed for about an hour at the bar at RubyConf 2009 by somebody who wanted to use Nokogiri on the Google App Engine, and you can't use the shared object libraries there. So the lessons I got out of this are, if you care about performance, you need to write native extensions. If you care about multi-platform, you need to support at least 2 code bases. And if you don't care about either, then FFI is totally for you. And I don't mean to be like cynical about that. Like, there are use cases. Martin Boschlet is using FFI encrypt because he's not making millions of calls through the C function interface. He makes one, it's CPU intensive, he gets the result back. It's a very different use case from Nokogiri, where you're calling C methods over and over again. You can look at this chart later, but it describes exactly why you need to do this. The outcomes were, we killed the FFI port. I published this long ranting blog post. Actually, I didn't publish it. It's still sitting on my hard drive. And I cried myself to sleep many, many days. This is actually the GitHub chart where I added FFI and then deleted FFI. So I should have listened to Linus, who said portability is for people who can't write new programs. This really means that, like, I was not willing or able to write a Java version of Nokogiri that would run natively. I just wanted to write it the same way I always had and make it work everywhere. Enter Sergio. So Sergio Arbio was a Spanish college student who got a gig on Google Summer of Code in 2009 and just spiked on making it work in pure Java, and it totally worked. So we created a Ruby bounty to finish up the pure Java port. It was $625, which was the largest one ever at the time. Here are the people who contributed money. Shout out to them. These are the people who actually took it across the finish line and finished the pure Java port of Nokogiri. And hey, look, Nokogiri is now a Java project. Even GitHub agrees. And the performance was amazing. It was much, much faster. So the 2 tall guys are FFI in different versions, and then the pure Java one. Just an amazing, amazing performance increase. At the time, there was this big thread about this. I'll skip this one because I'm a little low on time, but we ended up doing it native. We tried everything else. We had to go native, and it totally worked. You guys remember the FAQ from the beginning, right? I can't install Nokogiri. Yeah, okay. So really, this is a general problem. I can't install Nokogiri X on running Y, and this happens a lot. It's hard for a bunch of different reasons on different platforms, but the short version is dependencies. I'm going to go through in chronological order how we addressed installation issues. I got 3 minutes left. Let's see if I can do it. On Windows, nobody has a build tool chain, right? Maybe you have Visual Studio 6, but that's not good. If you're a Ruby guy, you probably don't. And nobody has libxml2 installed on their system. So how we got around this is we actually cross-compile all these libraries into DLLs. So on my Linux machine, on this guy right here, I cross-compile it for Windows, package it up in the gem, and it's called a fat binary gem. And you can see exactly how big. It's about 10 megs versus 200 KB for ordinary Nokogiri. And that's because we have to package up DLLs for 3 different versions of Ruby. Although I think we're going to stop supporting 1.8.7 soon. Does anybody care if I do that? Cool. Oh, stop. I wanted to give another shout out here to Louis Levina, who basically supports the window build system single-handedly. Rake-compiler and mini-porteel are super, super useful for building C extensions. Mini-porteel specifically will come up later. Helps you build autoconf packages. So libxml, I point mini-porteel at it, and untars it, autoconfs it, configures it, compiles it, pulls the libraries out, and sticks them into your gem. It's awesome. Are there any Ruby Windows developers out there? Okay. For people in YouTube land, 2 people raised their hand. I would love to talk to you afterwards. We need help supporting Windows, so tweet me maybe. Okay. So JRUBY kind of has the same problems where we have dependencies on these libraries that are probably not installed. We did exactly the same thing. We built jar files. We package them inside the gem. It's a fat binary on JRUBY is also. It's about 2 megs instead of 10, so a little smaller than Windows, but it's still fat. It's got all these jars sitting in it that get installed. On MRI, again, same problem. These are the 2 libraries that everybody has a hard time building, especially Mac users. I don't know what's wrong with you guys. Everybody has it installed in different places. If you have Homebrew and Mac ports, you probably have 3 versions of libxml installed on your Mac somewhere. It's pain for you, almost 1,000 different questions about Nokogiri installation. It's pain for me because I have to do things like, oh, if you're on version 2.6.16, do this thing. Really, really terrible. And this is what put me over the edge. I have less than a minute left. This is what put me over the edge. libxml 2.9 introduced a really horrible breaking bug in XPath queries, which was recently fixed. But then this became the default for Homebrew, so all these Mac people's CSS queries stopped working. So basically what I did was I used mini porteal. If you actually said this, thank you for paying attention. But mini porteal will actually go build libxml and libxslt at install time. So it's all the source code for those is embedded in the gem. And when you install it, it'll compile it on your system and use it. Just like a Cadbury egg, there's like a secret inside. It's awesome. It's good for you because installation just works. It's good for me. Time? Done? Okay.
Take another minute.
Thanks, Josh. You're so kind. I'll get to the things. I invented fat source gems. The future, there's a Nokogiri roadmap. Basically, we're going to be addressing APIs in 2.0 and fixing some architectural issues. Talk to me afterwards if you want to know about these. And a short call to action, which is, if you're a Windows MRI user, get involved. I want to be convinced to support Windows as a platform. It's really, really hard and time-consuming, and I think a lot of gem maintainers would appreciate the help and the involvement. And second, if you're not already, contribute to open source. You can start small, you can iterate on it, you can get a new job, you can make new friends. It's going to be awesome. Remember that Nokogiri does one boring thing, does it well. You're annoyed by something right now in somebody's gem. Go fix it. They will appreciate it. You'll make the world a better place. And you might get to hang out with Tenderlove. Thank you.